Oh, hold on a second. Here we go.
We are on live. Welcome everyone to the Living Parsha. This week we are studying the portion of Mishpatim, which is a fascinating parsha and a uh, deviation from everything we've been doing in the Torah till now. And so it's really a new beginning of the Torah narrative. It's a brand new section that is taking us to unknown areas. So just to sort of recap, the Torah from Genesis until now has been a narrative, a storyline from the stories of creation, Adam and Eve, down to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the 12 tribes, Joseph, Egypt and slavery, and then Moses and Exodus. We've been learning, reading a storybook, obviously with the profound lessons, with mitzvahs along the way, with all different spiritual, moral, ethical subplots, but ultimately it's been told through a storyline. Um, Here, for the first time, we have an entire section of law, which is what most people think when you think, what's, Torah, the guide to Jewish law, the book of laws, which until this point we have never encountered it yet. Mishpatim opens us up to a list of laws. And the truth is the name Mishpatim. Mishpat means judgment or laws. And so the name of the parasha, the title, is the laws, literally. You can't get more clear than that. And we're coming on the foot of last week's Torah reading, which we discussed at length last week, about the Sinaitic experience, the Jewish people receiving the Torah at Sinai, hearing the Ten Commandments from God, and the incredible experience they had then. And here we have the Elah HaMishpatim, these are the laws you should teach the Jewish people. God telling Moses to lay out the laws for the Jews. And for the most part, the laws we encounter are social laws, interpersonal laws. Okay, so we have a whole list of laws from how to treat a slave and a servant to how to deal with thievery, murder, um, property arguments, disputes. If something gets lost, who's responsible if I'm watching someone's things? And so there's almost the entire gamut of interpersonal law covered here. A social responsibility, how to treat the stranger, honoring your parents, sort of what the response to treating your parents in certain ways is. Um, and so we have this list of laws, even some laws of Judaism, which are ritual laws. For example, laws of kosher. We have don't mix milk and meat. One of the times it's mentioned in Torah is in this week's reading. We had the laws of the holidays, the Chagim, the basics of Jewish structure of life. Shabbos is again comes up again. So it's really a laundry list almost of the do's and the don'ts of, for the most part, our very human selves, our societal interactions, and how we should navigate them, which brings up many questions. And I'm going to just mention a couple of them. Um, we won't get into all of them this evening, but the first one I think is just worth mentioning is this necessary for Torah to provide us with the laws governing societal interactions? So Judaism, God says to the Jewish people, here is my vision for humanity. This is what I'm giving you, the vision for the Jewish people, the mitzvahs, how to deal with thievery, theft, how to deal with murder. Whatever society you belong to, we'll figure it out. America has a constitution. Throughout history, every country, society has figured out how to govern themselves. Why does Torah, this sort of sublime divine wisdom, need to address these very interpersonal, very mundane, uh, dealing with the messiness of human life without God telling me? I'd figure it out. What to do with someone who steals. All right, even trial and error till society gets it right. God, in his infinite wisdom, comes to Moses. Tell the Jewish people, here's how we treat someone who steals, what the payments should be, whether they need to swear, whether they need an oath. Very detailed description. Is that necessary? It's the first question I want to put on the table, um, which is interesting to think about. Then, right at the end of the parsha, we get this 180 turn. this surprise comes up right at the end, beginning of chapter 24. Uh, Literally, the last section of the Parsha, we return back to the description of Sinai, which we really read about last week. So I'll read that together inside because I think this is fascinating, and we'll get into how this fits in. Chapter 24. I won't read the whole thing, but I encourage you to read it on your own when you have the time.
And so I could, it's the sixth reading, seventh
It's
reading.
actually it's in the
Yep.
middle of the seventh reading, right? So we're halfway through the seventh reading. This is really the end of the end. And
What
chapter
verse number?
24,
Okay.
24 verse 1.
Okay. I got it.
And God says to Moses, go up to God, you, Aaron, Nadav, Avihu, the 70 elders, and prostrate yourselves from afar. So God invites Moses up the mountain. Moses alone must approach God, the others may not approach, nor may the people ascend the mountain with him. Repetition from last week. Only Moses can go up the mountain, everyone else must stay below. And then we have Moses came and told the people God's word. The entire people responded with one voice. All the words that God has spoken, we will do. Seems very reminiscent of the narrative from last week. And it goes on to describe a slightly different description of what happened at that mountain when Moses receives this sort of book, which the book of the covenant. He reads it to the Jews. They say, yes, we will do this. They build altars, they offer offerings to God. So there's this sort of parallel narrative of Sinai that pops up here at the end of the parsha, which just dealt with all kind of the practical laws of society. So if we would zoom out on the last two parshas, we have this very strange thing where in Parshas Yitro, we have last week description of this incredible moment of revelation at Sinai, and with all of its pomp and grandeur, there's lightning and thunder and God's voice ringing out throughout the world. Then we have Moses come into the Jewish people and say, hey, I have actually a really detailed list of practical laws that govern society. And then we have, oh, let me tell you a story at Sinai, a parallel description. So there's a lot of commentary here about what to make of all this. Some understand this second sort of Sinaitic description at the end of Mishpatim is actually happened after Matan Torah, after giving of the Torah. So there's the original giving of the Torah, where God gave it last week's Parsha. Then Moses tells the Jewish people some of the laws. And then he goes back up the mountain for a second round where he receives the rest of the Torah and he's there for 40 days until the next, he comes down in the golden calf and the whole story. So some actually
And
look at
so
this.
from, so just so I'm following. So this week's Parsha, ascension of Sinai, is a different ascension of the Sinai than last week's Parsha?
That's according to some commentaries. Some understand it that way because otherwise, why is it written again? Right? It seems to be kind of the most simplistic understanding if you're following the storyline. This is a new ascension. This is a second coming, a second episode where there's now not just God giving the Jewish people the Torah, the Ten Commandments. There's this kind of covenant, and the Jews are celebrating it with offerings. So it's something different that happens afterwards. That's sort of one track in the commentaries. Other commentaries, Rashi, the most sort of famous commentary among them, say no. If you look at the wording here, this very clearly seems to be the same episode at Sinai, the same giving of the Torah, and for some reason it's broken up into two. Some details told the first time around, some details told the second time around, and but it's the same exact storyline, same episode, the same giving of the Torah. Either way we slice it, I think it's kind of begs for some sort of commentary. Whether it's two different episodes, why was the sort of the revelation and covenant broken into two episodes? Or if it's one episode, why is the telling of it broken into two different stories? And
So sorry.
these two,
So
yeah,
what are the verses that make might make you think that it's a different episode because it kind of, I mean, just looking at last week's and this week's, it kind of feels like it just rolls right from the Ten Commandments to these laws. So like what is the part that makes it seem like a different story or a different
Sure.
No,
Last
the
week's
fact
part.
that yeah, sorry, Greg.
I was gonna say, just that point, last week's Parsha, remember, you emphasized it. Um, People say, we will do, we will hear. And I remember you emphasizing the sequence of that. This week's Parsha says, oh, I think the exact same thing,
So
well,
simply,
as one example of what Seth is saying and what we're discussing.
yeah, I mean, where I was going with that is, I mean, I'm just looking at like last week's portion. It ends, "You shall not ascend my altar and my son's steps, that your nakedness will not be uncovered upon it." And then it just rolls into, "And these are the ordinances that you shall place before them." So it seems like it just continues to me.
right. So the beginning of the parsha may just continue,
Yeah.
but if we skip forward to the end of this week's parsha, chapter 24,
Okay.
where there's another description of the experience at Sinai. Moses is told to go up the mountain, and he confers with God, goes back to the Jewish people, sharing with them, very reminiscent of last week's parsha. And the question is this episode a second episode of a mountain of Moses on
I see.
Sinai,
Okay.
or is it repetition of the episode from last week's parsha?
Got it. Okay.
And there's the commentaries have no consensus here. There's different ways of understanding it. The reason you would understand it's two different episodes is because it's written twice. It's a simple reading. We had one story, a bunch of laws, a second story. But Rashi and others have indications in the text and reason to believe that it's all one episode, told twice. Two narratives, twin narratives of the exact same story. And it's, it sounds strange, but think about it in terms of like human experience. If I and you attend an event or a concert, right? And then we come back and we're describing what happens. We're describing the same event. Chances are we'll have slightly different descriptions because what moved me, what I noticed, was different to what you noticed and what excited you about it. And so, even though the exact same event happened, from different perspectives, different lenses, is going to be told differently. And so, if you're in understanding as one story, there must be a reason why we're being told the story through two different lenses.
Mm.
And different details are highlighted in each of these narratives. Something different is trying to come across. Torah is trying to give us something different in these two narratives of the exact same event. Make sense?
Yep.
Yep. I'm
So
anxious
just
to hear
before
what you're
we
going to say about it.
okay, so before we go into that, two things I want to discuss, two interesting items. Number one, and Greg brought this up earlier, the idea that there's no order in Torah necessarily, right? That some parts of Torah are written out of order. And there are quite a few examples. One may be the end of this parsha, may not be, depending who you ask. One would have been last week's parsha when Yitro advised Moses how to set up his courts, which, for all intents and purposes, only makes sense after Torah was given. And there are earlier examples and later examples throughout the Torah. There are many instances where it just seems that there's no other way to read it besides looking at it as a puzzle that is not in order. And Greg asked this question, and many others asked this question: why? What a strange way to write a book. To have to flip back pages, forward pages, figure out a storyline that's inconsistent, it's not chronological. Why would Torah do this? So, on a simple level, each instance should be sort of judged on its own merit. Why, in this case, was it out of order? And we'll look at that today, specifically here, why it may have been out of order. But on a wholesale level, I think it does give us some kind of perspective of what Torah is and what it is not. Too often we look at Torah as this kind of storybook. It's the history of the Jewish people, right? It's our origin story. And there's truth to that. It's not true. But the word Torah actually does not mean story. It's not mean history. Torah means a guide. Torah means it's from the word or, light. It's shedding light on our journey. It's telling us how to a lesson on how to behave, how to act.
Do some
And
people say that Torah means teaching, or is it always guide?
well, the exact translation comes with hora'ah. Hora'ah means teaching, but a teaching not in a sort of a frontal teaching way, which is limud, learning, or something similar to that, Talmud. Hora'ah means teaching in a way that's a guidance, a shedding light on something, similar to an or. So it's teaching in a sense that I'm teaching you a lesson, right? It's teaching us something. It's not just giving us information. It's using that information, using the story to enlighten us about life, about ourselves, the universe, about our role here. All that's part of the Torah narrative. And so when you're telling a story for the story's sake, you want to make sure you get the details right. You want to get it in order. You want to get everything perfect. When I have a sort of different reason I'm telling the story. The story isn't for its own sake. This is a story, it's a way of me communicating a certain truth. It's a way of conveying ideals. Then sometimes the exact storyline isn't so important. Or there are reasons why I want to group these things together, even though it didn't happen in order, because they go together in the picture that I'm painting, even if not historically accurate that way. So every detail in Torah is historically accurate. They're real, they're true. Torah is truth. But it's not meant to be a storyline that's a narrative chronological. It's meant to be giving over certain ideas, certain truths. And sometimes it works better not to do that in order. And so we're going to look today specifically, drill down why this particular narrative of Sinai is placed here again. When did it happen? When were the laws given? Right? So we have the two Sinai narratives, in between them, a whole host of laws. When did Moses teach these?
And to interrupt you, as you're saying, Jethro says to Moses, the way you're judging it's not a good system. What was Moses using as his basis of law before he ascended the mountain and got the Torah?
So that's a great question, which what drives the commentaries to understand that story of Jethro happened after the Torah, happened after all
Ah,
this, right? Because
okay.
what else is he judging based on? Again, some others say no, he was the basics of law, which he did know or understood it, intuited. It's not clear, like most is unclear. There are many opinions, but ultimately, Rashi, the foremost commentary, says exactly that. This story of Jethro happened later, right? So it's all one big mish. Yitro is out of order, Mishpatim is out of order. This whole thing is like a washing machine mixing this up. So we have these two Sinai narratives. Let's forget them for a second. In between, we have the meat of the sandwich, which is the laws, Mishpatim, all those laws that speak about how we interact with people, speak about kosher, speak about dealing with the messiness of theft and murder. When were they taught? So there's, I think, three different ways of understanding this. One midrash says these laws actually were taught before Sinai. Okay, like we have in the Parsha this week, all the laws and then the Sinai narrative, because these laws
Did
actually were
Abraham
taught beforehand.
did
No,
Abraham know the laws?
he may have known them, but they weren't explicitly taught to him. But this happened as the Jews were traveling from Egypt to Sinai. They camped at a place called Mara, where the waters were bitter. We had 2 weeks ago the portion, and there they got some laws. The pasuk there tells us, the verse says over there, Sham Sam Lo Chok Mishpat. There Moses gave them uh, law and justice. It's not clear what it means. Some means it means very conceptual ideas. Some say it refers to some specific things, but some say it refers to all the laws that were taught here, and which kind of makes sense because before the Jews can accept the Torah, they said we'll do everything God said. They have to have some kind of idea what they're accepting. In a contemporary example, if someone wants to convert to Judaism, they come to a rabbi and say, I'm willing to do whatever you tell me, whatever Judaism says, convert me today. I'm on board no matter what. I'm blindly following. No rabbi will convert them. Why? Not necessarily because they don't trust you. It's not considered a commitment if you don't have any idea what you're committing to? You're committing to nothing, to a word, to a title, a Jew. It's not commitment. Unless you know some basics of what Judaism is, then you can say, oh, that, whatever it is I understand of Judaism, I'm committing to that. Without that basic fundamentals, you're not actually committing to anything. And so the Jewish people, if they were going to commit to God, there had to be some basics they knew beforehand. And so this Midrash says, this Parsha is the basics. How to treat people well, how to deal with interpersonal disputes, kosher, Shabbat, holidays. They got these basics, and they were ready to then tell God, Naaseh, we will do everything you want us to do. Give us the Torah. So that's one understanding. These laws came earlier. A second understanding, second way of reading this, is that these laws came right after Sinai. Moses got the Torah at Sinai. The first thing he taught the Jewish people was this. Next
After
day,
he descended from Sinai,
he comes down, descends from Sinai
comes
the
down.
next day, and teaches these laws. A third reading is that Moses goes back to Sinai for 40 days. During those 40 days, he learned all the laws of Torah, then comes down and teaches it to the Jewish people. This is 40 days later. But if we can divide those into two general groups, either before Sinai or post Sinai, right? Okay, so these are details. Let's look at the overall picture, and there's two things we want to address tonight in the overall picture. Number one is, what are the two narratives of Sinai? And number two, why are these laws coming right between them? If you were to think of what Judaism is, sort of the fundamentals of Judaism, and we discussed this last week a little bit about why the Ten Commandments were chosen, the two tablets, and the idea there's a sort of religious side to Judaism and a moral side to Judaism. There's a how we interface with God in faith and how we interface with other human beings in an ethical way. And both are relevant, important. But if you look at the parsha, it seems to be a focus very specifically on very messy human life. Having a slave. Now, without getting into the politics of this, of whether slavery was ever okay, and in truth is the laws of slavery in Torah are actually sort of giving honor and respect to a slave, which was then commonplace, and almost weaning the people off slavery. The Talmud says that if you follow the strictures of Torah, acquiring a slave is really acquiring a master for yourself. The treatment you have to treat someone who worked for you, you have to give them everything you had to give them as well, the same quality food and pillow and blanket and bed. You have to treat them with such respect. You have to support their family. So the Talmud jokes and says, by taking in a slave, you're basically acquiring a master. So, but still, it's dealing with that side of human life, about thieves, about murder, about someone who hits their parents. These are laws which not only deal with the messes of human life, would not have been relevant mostly to the Jewish people who were then living in this bubble of paradise in the desert. All their food was coming from heaven. They had no sort of societal obligations, no civic obligations. They didn't own property or land. These laws would have been so foreign. And yet, the first thing we're told, whether it was the first thing they were heard, which probably also, the first thing we're told, and they heard, was, guys, you just experienced the revelation. You had this incredible spiritual moment with God. Guess what? Here's what God wants from you. And you can imagine the Jews' ears perk up. This is a Judaism about to uncover the secrets of the universe. And Moses says, here's how you got to treat a slave. And here's what you do when someone steals from you. And here's how you make sure people are honest when they testify in court. And here's what you do when someone by accidentally murders somebody. Really? This is the Judaism we were so excited for? This is we were counting down 7 weeks from Egypt? Sounds so, anticlimactic. And it's just strange. So any suggestions here?
I have a comment, and that is until you spoke about it, I never quite put the two and two together. I never realized that I guess I was looking from a perspective of thousands of years later and understanding that what life goes on, but I took great perspective I never thought about. So I don't have any idea, but I would like to recognize that. Thank you.
Everyone else, any suggestions? Okay, so I'll mention a couple of ideas that I think are resonate, a couple of sort of commentaries that are suggested. Number one, I think it's just a very simple idea that this sort of shock value was the point. Moses was telling the Jewish people, to be a good Jew, you got to be a good person,
A good human.
good human. Of course, there's much more to Judaism than that, but at the end of the day, don't get lost in this spiritual idealism. Don't get lost in a personal journey. Focus. Remember that you got to treat people well, and never lose sight of that. Be a mensch. So that's sort of one direction this can go in. The other idea is, and we spoke about this last week, how in Judaism, the spiritual and the ethical are not two different tracks. They actually are in sync and they interface with each other, interplay with each other. And so our spiritual faith, our relationship with Hashem, is what informs our treatment of other human beings. And the same is true, the treatment of other human beings informs our faith as well, and our spiritual, as part of our spiritual journey. And so they're not sort of even equal tracks, they're actually both part of one wholesome organism of Judaism. And so, to a certain extent, there's value in the very practical manifestation or application of our deepest spiritual ideals. How do you know if someone really has faith? Someone can be the most religious person outwardly, praying and observing, but if they are going to maybe cheat someone in business or steal something that isn't theirs, that's an indication their faith in God isn't whole. If you really had faith, you would know whatever you have, you're supposed to have. And what if someone else's is meant for you? And I believe God will provide for me whatever I do when I do it ethically. And so the sort of the yardstick of a religious devotion is in how we treat someone else. We have this parallel on Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year, and we're fasting and we're spending our day in prayer and we're speaking about, going deeper and deeper. And then it comes the afternoon of Yom Kippur. So we've already done a whole Kol Nidre, the evening service, the morning service, Musaf. We've been through a lot. And at Mincha, so we're kind of an hour and a half, 2 hours away from the end of Yom Kippur. We've been through all the work. And the Torah reading chosen for the Mincha service Yom Kippur is about illicit sexual relationships, adultery. Really? That's what we're dealing with now? And one idea, there's many ways of looking at it. One idea is, yes, we're human beings. We have very human struggles, and don't want to ignore them. But what's the yardstick that Yom Kippur was successful? How do I know you had a spiritual growth? How do I know you really moved, not just went through the motions? If your ethical behavior, if the way you treat others, if the way you control your own sexual desire after Yom Kippur is in line with God's directives. And so it's a very human and physical and material application that is the greatest yardstick of the spiritual growth and journey.
And the sexual drive is such a powerful drive, and it's there. I remember something that Jonathan Sachs said, the circumcision of desire. And that comes to mind that, so here we are going through the entire Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur process. And then, as you're saying, we have to address our most basic, natural, emotional drive. And are we going to discipline ourselves or not? Have we learned to recognize the need for discipline, and will we execute the discipline in it? It's a
It's
yardstick,
easy
as
to
you said.
commit. Yeah, it's easy to commit to being a good person in shul. Right? I'm sitting there in a synagogue. Of course, I'm gonna be perfect from now on. But if I walk out of there and go home back to your regular routine, will I be a changed person? Will it affect me? That is really the test, whether there was real shift on Yom Kippur, right? It's not only don't forget about that side of yourself, it's that's where it comes to a play. Is it real? You know it's real when you act that way. I'll know someone has real faith when they're honest in business. Because then it's not only like paying lip service or while I'm in shul, I'm davening, I mean it for real. I'm sacrificing my own livelihood. I could make more money if I cheat a little here, but I believe in God. I'm not gonna. So when I'm willing to apply it in ways that affect me as a real human being in my life, then it's real. That's sort of it's coming down to its application in its furthest sense. Another sort of step in this is there's actually value in the material or the very human interactions beyond the spiritual, because that's where we encounter God within the world. We're not meant to just be good people and find God in our own lives. We have a job in this world to heal the world, to bring divine consciousness into the universe. We don't do that only through prayer. There's so much of the world that isn't affected by prayer. Wall Street isn't being touched by my prayer in the shul. How is divine consciousness entering Wall Street when I am ethical in my business dealings? And so in that moment where I'm honest or I'm governing my interactions with Torah's governance, I'm saying I'm inviting God into that area of my life. I'm inviting God into that corner of the universe. And so there's something achieved in that application of Judaism that is much deeper and even more spiritually profound than having a personal spiritual relationship with God through prayer, through meditation, whatever experience you're going to have. So there's sort of purpose of Torah that's achieved specifically when it governs our everyday human interactions. The messiness, the brokenness of the human experience, the faults of humanity. When Torah is able to govern that area of life, I have now opened up even that distant space, even that very imperfect space to God and brought God there. And so there's incredible opportunity, specifically in these laws, to uncover God in every area of our lives in the world. So that may be, these are all along the same lines, slightly maybe further in the yardstick of why these are the first laws after the Sinai experience. Now let's trace our steps back and say why there needed to be two examples, two interactions of Har Sinai, of the beginning of the Torah. And I think a close reading of each of these will make this clearer. I'm not going to do that right here because it's hot on the Zoom, and I will let you do this on your own afterwards, after I give this. But if we look closely at the text and the way it's described last week's Parsha, and the way it's described in this week's Parsha, each one is highlighting a very different element of the event, of the historic event. Last week, we had the Ten Commandments, right? And they were given with incredible, it was an overwhelming experience. To the point the Jews were afraid, they trembled. They told Moses, we can't hear this from God anymore. We want you to tell it to us. It was an overwhelming divine experience that was top down. God came down the mountain, and the spiritual experience was top down, and even the very idea of giving mitzvahs is top down. A command means I am the authority, you are my subject, I am telling you what to do. You follow. That's a relationship of authority, relationship that tells me that we are just submitting ourselves to God's vision. And so that aspect of giving the Torah is a huge one. That's one we usually highlight. God came to the Jewish people and gave them a Torah. That is sort of the whole event from that lens, from the lens of authority, to the lens of the mitzvahs. This is what happened. These are the parts of the story that are important. They're telling us that we have to follow whatever God said. The Jewish people were taken out of Egypt, and God said, "You're no longer going to be servants to Pharaoh. Now you're my servants. You're my subjects. And here is how I'm doing it." And so that whole sort of Judaism that emerges from last week's Torah reading is one where we are sort of imprinted in the divine mission. God is telling us what to do, and we are following. God is appearing to the Jewish people in a way that almost gives no room for their own self-expression. There's no way of me being in this relationship, which is why it caused them to tremble. It's overwhelming experience. They fainted according to the Midrash. They almost died. Because in this experience of God, there's no space for me. And so I pass out. I'm overwhelmed by this. And what does it create? Subservience. In last week's Torah portion, when Moses asked the Jews, "Do you want this?" They said, "Naaseh, we will do." One word. We are on board. That's the narrative of last week's giving of the Torah. Naaseh, we are totally subservient. And this is the entire dynamic, really, of laws. The idea of in any society, even a democratic society, when we have lawmakers creating law, it's a hierarchy where I, a regular citizen, have to follow the law. So the law is above me. I can't I come to a red light and there's nobody around. I can't say, "Hey, I'm making an executive decision based on the circumstances. I have a better read of the situation than the government who created a law. I have to stop at a red light. I'll go to the red light. If there's a camera there, I'll still get a ticket." Why? Because the law doesn't care about my feelings. The law is above me, and I am subjected to it. I have to submit myself to something which is beyond me. Now, of course, in a democratic society, we have some kind of say who the lawmakers will be. Fine. But ultimately, any system of law is a top-down system where we have to follow a greater system than ourselves. And it comes to Torah and mitzvahs, God's law, it's the ultimate top-down. It's a divine authority that I really have no say in creating the law. I have really, not necessarily do I even understand the law fully, but I have to follow it. Because God told me to do this. In some laws, it's like, don't mix milk and meat. What? It's irrelevant. This is what God said. That's real submission to authority. And some laws kind of observe Shabbat because God rested in the seventh day. All right, it resonates with me. I understand that I'm observing a historic occasion, but still, has to do it in this way. I can't decide this Shabbat I'm gonna, or I can't decide I observe Shabbat in a different way. It's still law. And so even a law and even the laws of dealing with murder or theft or damages, which are kind of very rational. If you stole something, you pay back, and sometimes you pay back double as a punishment. These are all kind of very rational laws. Still, when I do it, I have to follow the specific laws God wanted from me. It's another way of me submitting myself to God. All right, I asked at the beginning of the class why God would want to get into the weeds of interpersonal and societal law. Because when I now follow this, I'm not just doing something which is good, I'm doing something godly. So every time I treat someone with respect, I'm not just doing something good, I'm doing something godly. I'm doing a mitzvah. It's another way of submitting myself to God's law. So every area of my life is governed by divine authority. This creates a relationship where we are entirely sort of losing ourselves and just trying to allow God to be in control. Obviously, we have free choice. I'm not a robot, but my ideal is to be subservient, to be submissive to the divine vision for the world, to God's laws. That is Sinai narrative number one. That's act one. And that is, one way of looking at Judaism in a very relevant way. But there was something else going on at Sinai, something else at play, which also is a huge element in Judaism. And that is our relationship with God. Not just submissive. Submissive means I don't exist here. Only God exists, and I'm trying to get out of the way. Then there is, hey, God says to me, to you, to all of us, I want a relationship with you. Imagine you try having a relationship, you have a spouse, and whatever you say, they say, sure. They don't have no opinion of their own. They're just doing everything you want. This is not a relationship. Some people say it's bliss. It's great. No. I don't want you to say yes, 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 because then there's no other person there. I don't need you in my life if you're only going to say whatever, yes, whatever I say. The whole idea of relationship is two different people. And there's some beauty in that harmony when two people with different opinions, different personalities, are able to live a life together. That's a relationship. Some total submission means you're not there, you're not present. Who am I having a relationship with? Nobody. I want you to be there. I want you to live out your best, be yourself. Sometimes it will conflict with me. Great. That's you. I want you. Let's figure out how to navigate that conflict. Let's get deeper than that. Let's find a space where we can connect beyond our differences. That's relationship. And God says to the Jewish people, I want to develop a covenant, which is the term used in this week's Parsha. We don't have the Aseret HaDibrot. We don't have the laws being given. We have Sefer HaBrit, the book of the covenants. What's being highlighted in the storyline this week is God says to the Jews, I have a covenant. What does a covenant mean? I'm making a deal. When there's a deal, there's two sides to the equation. I will give you something. You'll contribute something to me. We have mutual ground here. We're going to make a deal. We'll shake hands on something. A covenant is God's relationship with the Jewish people. And by extension, God's relationship with the world, with the universe. These are two different things which go hand in hand. I'll explain what that means. On a personal level, God says to the Jew, I don't want you to submit, to shut off your own thinking, and just be, as much as you can, be a robot. Follow my instructions. God doesn't need me for that. He created me, Menashe Wolf, to be my personality, with my way of thinking, with my unique upbringing and set of circumstances that brought me to this moment in my life. And he wants, within the person that I am, to appreciate the Judaism, to be able to develop an awareness of God, and to contribute something that was never here before. So I was never here before. God wants a relationship with me and with each of you and every single person. I don't want you to disappear. I don't want submission. I want you, who you are, to be able to experience divine. It's much easier to be submissive. It's much easier to say, I'm shutting off, I'll follow whatever you want. Deal. It's easier, but less rewarding. There's less opportunity for real relationship. God, take the hard route. Be who you are within your own life, your own thinking, your own everything. And even there, relate to God. Even there, find a way where you appreciate the mitzvahs. And that way, God isn't just imposing his will on the world. He is being experienced within the world, within our reality. Right? So when it's on a personal level, we have a relationship with God. By extension, on a universal level. We're not saying in order for God to be real in our world, it's by our world being pushed aside. Everything that we know from our society has to be neglected and just follow what God wants. No. Then God is never really being brought into the world. He's only here when we ignore the world. But God wanted to be a relationship with the universe. The only way we do that is within the universe, within our way of living, within our very real world, we're able to create space. We contribute something here as well, which is why when we're told the story in this week's Parsha, when Moses comes with the book of the covenant and reads it to the Jewish people, their response is not just na'aseh, we will do. Their response is na'aseh v'nishma. We will do, but committing ourselves to God, v'nishma, we'll listen. We'll hear. We'll try to figure it out. Where we exist. And not just performing the walking the walk. Nishma, I'm gonna listen. I'm gonna try to take this in. I'm gonna understand this. I'm gonna be present in this relationship. It's a very different Judaism. It's a very different perspective. Now, which is better and worse? They're both important. They're both true. And Torah wants to highlight both of these. But if it tells us the story of Sinai once, putting both of them in there, it'll get lost. The only way to highlight sort of these two distinct modes of living our Judaism, two distinct ways of interacting with God, with our faith, is by putting them as two different tellings of the same story. And that way, Torah is saying, this is true and this is true. This is one experience of Sinai. This is a different experience of Sinai. And both were present when God came to the Jewish people. Both elements of submission and of our own presence being needed here, our own contribution. In this week's Parsha, all the details we read about it all fit in with this. The Jews offered sacrifices. It wasn't just about what I keep receiving. They offered something of their own. Their worship here was relevant. Right? So all of these are details. There's no overwhelming experience in the Parsha this week. We don't read about an overwhelming experience which caused them to tremble. That's not the storyline here. The storyline here is very, approachable. It wasn't about pushing the Jew, pushing individual personality aside. It's about integrating our faith within our personality, of our relationship with God, of us building this duality, this dual relationship. We exist and God exists, and we're navigating life together. So these are the two Judaisms. Now let's look at what came right after each of these experiences of Sinai. The first experience of Sinai, you know what comes back next? A list of laws. Because how is that Judaism experienced? Follow. This is how I want you to live your life. A, B, C. Do this, don't do that. This is how you should judge this case. That's the Yisro narrative of the Torah, is then followed with this week's Mishpatim, all the laws. What comes after this week's telling of the Sinai experience? In next week's portion, what's the next thing we begin reading about? The Mishkan, building a temple for God within the community. The Jewish people were able on their own to construct a home, to build a structure that God would be present within their society, within their community. They built this. The human efforts were able to create a space where God was present. It wasn't about being submissive. It wasn't about just following. It was about within a Mishkan is something, historical building. But what does it mean for us? Creating a space, a temple for God in our world, in our inner world, in our lives, is being able to house God as a guest in my own life. That's the second narrative of Judaism, the covenant, where I can create a space for God within my life, within my living. I don't have to negate myself. I don't have to escape society. I don't have to push away my own ambitions and wants. Within my distinct life, my personality, my own desires, I'm able to create space for God. I'm able to have this relationship with God lives within me. I'm here and God is here. I'm a human being with drives that don't always match what God wants from me. So I will need to submit sometimes, but also I can take the sort of desire that's coming from and say, hey, we're going to channel this for good. We're going to find God even within that space of life. So to be a healthy Jew, these are both necessary. We need discipline. We also need the sort of creativity, the ability to find God and create God, create space for God in our lives. And both go hand in hand. I will note that which narrative comes first? The submission, the discipline. Because if we, even though, so I think what comes first is sort of chronologically, or not chronologically. First in Torah, what should the foundation, but what comes second is sort of the ultimate realization. And so the first step we should take is a submission because we're human beings, and to try sort of dive in deep end and say, hey, as a flawed human being, I'm going to discover God in my life. You get very misled. And it happens all the time. People who have kind of developed their own notion of God, which is very distant to what God actually is, because they're trying to create space for God in their lives, but they're kind of creating God in their own image. So they're not making space for God in their lives, making a new God which fits their lives. And so the first step is the humility and discipline to be submissive. There's a greater truth that I have to follow. I have to be subservient to a truth greater than myself. But once I have that baseline faith and conviction, then the ultimate realization is not to stay there, but then to try to go back and say, okay, I know God is true. I know I have to follow the law of the Torah. I know this is all real. But now let me go back to who I am and how can I fit that into my personality? How can I be present while God is still present? How can I build that relationship, the covenantal relationship with God? And both need to exist hand in hand. And it's easy to err to one side or the other. It's easy to be over disciplined or be over ambitious in creating space for God in a very real way in your own world, own life. But the balance is the secret to Judaism. Being able to follow, but also say, I exist here, and God wants a relationship with me. And the fascinating thing is, in observance, we're all going to be the same because we're subservient to the same truth. So I'm going to follow the same law as you follow. In the relationship model, we're all going to be different. My relationship with God will be different to yours because I am different to you. And so there's this, within Judaism, we're all living the same Judaism, and we're all having a different experience of it. We're praying the same texts, but our prayer is very different because there's a submission, there's also the covenant, the relationship. And within that relationship, it's very personal, it's very real, it's authentic. My authentic self is different to your authentic self. And to pretend otherwise is to, again, ignore myself and sort of be submissive. I want to copy you means I am leaving myself and saying, I'm going to follow something. Following means I'm not here. I put myself aside. So it's going to be a very different relationship that you have and that I have. That's beautiful because that means it's real. It's God's connecting in my space in my life and connecting your space to your life. And we know that it's real because my space is different and your space is different. And therefore, if it's authentic, that will look different to me than it will to you. So,
Question.
yeah.
Sorry. Take two tzaddiks at the same level, same age. Do they have a different experience with God?
Good question. So two perfect people that are living the perfect reality. It would be less, yes, it would be different, but less different to what I'm describing here. Because a tzaddik, in its truest sense, someone who has no longer harbors any sort of negativity, doesn't have a drive outside of God. And so there's no sort of, the self has been lessened. But there's still a personality, there's still a self, not an unholy self, but a holy self that's different. And the personality, look at Moses and his brother Aaron, both tzaddiks, both leaders of the Jewish people, radically different personalities. One was the master of truth, Moses, Aaron was of love and peace. And that played out in their roles, being a lawgiver, being the high priest, played out in how they interacted with people. So their own selves expressed their faith, their relationship with God, and how they shepherded the people in different ways because of who they were as people. It wasn't just, hey, I'm telling you blindly to follow God. I exist here, and the way I experience my faith is in a way of truth. The eyes in my face, the way of love and peace. And they may be odd sometimes because the God that I'm experiencing is the same God, but I'm relating to him differently because I'm a different person.
Thanks. Also, when you were speaking before about discipline and unbridled passion, like enthusiasm, does it relate to Chesed, Gevurah, and then eventually to Ferris?
Yes. It's not exactly the same here, but it is along the same lines. Yeah. Okay. So this is a a broad overview of the parsha this week and how it fits into the storyline or the non-linear storyline. Um, and then we continue next week with implementing this in the building of the Mishkan, which we'll discuss next week, God willing. Next week we'll be back in
How many?
person for those. Yeah,
Sorry, how many more parshas before the golden calf?
two more than the third one, Golden Calf. Which also maybe these next few parsha may also be out of order. So we're gonna go there, but it's a discussion for itself when they happened. Yeah. Thank you all for joining. And next week we'll be
Thank
back in
you.
person for those that are local. Looking forward to seeing you all here. But this has been wonderful, and I'm looking forward to
Thank
another
you very
week.
much.
Enjoy the rest of your week. Have
Bye bye.
Thanks.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. Bye.
a good night. Bye.